In late August 1997, Prince Charles flew to Paris beside two women who understood his history with Diana better than almost anyone alive. Lady Sarah McCorquodale had once dated him. Lady Jane Fellows was married to the Queen's most powerful private secretary. Now both sisters were traveling to bring Diana home in a coffin. The journey forced three conflicting loyalties into one silent space: former husband, blood family, and crown. Were Sarah and Jane merely grieving sisters, or had their earlier choices helped leave Diana painfully alone? To understand what each woman carried onto that aircraft, we must return to the first family crisis they survived together. Long before palace briefings and televised confessions, the Spencer sisters learned that a grand house could shelter a deeply divided family. Sarah was born in 1955, Jane followed in 1957, and Diana arrived in 1961. Their ancestry offered status, proximity to royalty, and expectations extending across generations. It offered no protection from a collapsing marriage. Their father, Edward John Spencer, and their mother, Frances, separated during the 1960s. The dispute that followed became a bruising contest over custody, loyalty, and reputation. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, Frances's own mother, testified in support of her son-in-law. The court ultimately left the children mainly in their father's care. The divorce did not bring emotional clarity. Frances began another life, while the children remained within the Spencer world their father represented. Visits, loyalties, and memories became divided between adults whose accounts of the marriage could not easily be reconciled. For children, such a conflict creates an impossible demand. Loving one parent can feel like betraying the other. Sarah, as the eldest daughter, encountered that pressure before Jane and Diana were old enough to understand its language. That decision carried heavy weight within the family. It appeared to show that a mother could be opposed by her own mother when order and respectability were at stake. We cannot know precisely what each child understood from the proceedings, yet it is reasonable to ask whether they absorbed the same unsettling lesson. When private love threatened public stability, private love might lose. The three girls did not respond alike. Sarah made discomfort visible. Jane sought safety through discipline, achievement, and restraint. Diana appeared to carry separation as an open emotional wound, returning repeatedly to fears of rejection and abandonment. These differences should not be treated as diagnoses written backward from later events. Personality, circumstance, and memory all shape their choices. Still, the pattern is difficult to ignore. One sister challenged limits, another mastered them, while the youngest kept searching for reassurance they could never reliably provide. Perhaps Sarah and Jane were always fundamentally different, or perhaps the same childhood taught them opposite survival strategies. Sarah learned to speak before others could define her. Jane learned that silence prevented chaos from spreading. Diana would eventually choose a third path. She would turn private suffering into public testimony, confronting the system that required silence. But Sarah reached her crisis first, and her distress appeared in a form the aristocratic world preferred not to discuss. At school, Sarah developed a reputation for confidence and independence. She attended Riddlesworth Hall before moving to West Heath, where Jane and Diana would also study. Later descriptions sometimes exaggerated Sarah into a reckless society girl, as though rebellion explained everything that followed. That picture is too convenient. Beneath the social confidence, Sarah struggled with anorexia during early adulthood. At a time when eating disorders were poorly understood, the illness could be dismissed as vanity, temperament, or youthful excess. Its reality was far more severe. Food, weight, and control became entangled with emotional pain she could not easily express. Recovery was unlikely to follow a clean upward line. Eating disorders can alter concentration, mood, and the ability to trust one's own perceptions. They also encourage secrecy, especially in families where composure carries social importance. Sarah's apparent confidence could therefore coexist with intense private vulnerability. The very qualities that made her entertaining in company, speed, candor, and bravado, may also have concealed how seriously she was struggling. The surrounding culture made that pain harder to name. Young aristocratic women were watched, evaluated, and prepared for advantageous marriages. Their appearance carried social value, while emotional need could be treated as embarrassing weakness. Sarah possessed rank and opportunity, yet many of the important choices around her remained shaped by family expectation and male approval. Could controlling her body have offered control over something that was truly hers? The record cannot establish that motive, but the possibility helps explain why privilege and illness were not contradictions. A person may live among wealth and still feel powerless within her own life. During this vulnerable period, Sarah became involved with Gerald Grosvenor, later the 6th Duke of Westminster. He represented one of the most prominent Irish aristocratic families in Britain. Their relationship carried the appearance of a brilliant match, joining affection, wealth, and social expectation in one future. It did not last. Later accounts connected the breakup with Sarah's worsening health. That does not prove Gerald caused her eating disorder. Emotional illness rarely begins with one disappointment, however devastating. The separation may instead have struck a structure already weakened by childhood loss, social pressure, and fragile self-worth. Which interpretation is closer to the truth? Did romantic rejection push Sarah into crisis, or did it merely expose a crisis already underway? Either way, the public story reduced her pain to another failed aristocratic romance. The private reality was more complicated and considerably less glamorous. Sarah eventually emerged from that period with her characteristic directness intact. She had survived an illness, a painful breakup, and the scrutiny attached to her name. Then another eligible man entered her social world. This time, he was not simply wealthy or well-connected. He was the future king. Sarah and Prince Charles began appearing together during the late 1970s. They attended polo matches, race meetings, and society events, while newspapers watched for signs of a royal engagement. Sarah was lively and candid. Charles appeared to enjoy her company, and the pairing made immediate sense to observers searching for a suitable future princess. The pressure surrounding such a relationship was unlike an ordinary courtship. Every outing became evidence. Every photograph invited predictions. Sarah, who had recently endured both illness and rejection, was suddenly being discussed as a possible wife to the Prince of Wales. Charles was also under pressure. As heir, he was expected to choose a bride considered young, respectable, and socially suitable. Courtship was never entirely private because marriage carried dynastic consequences. Sarah met many conventional requirements, but her refusal to perform perfect discretion created a problem. The future princess was expected to be interesting enough to charm the public, yet controlled enough never to embarrass the institution. For a while, the attention may have restored something she had lost. She was no longer simply the young woman left by Gerald Grosvenor. She occupied the center of a national romance narrative, and the press wanted access to every part of it. That access produced the episode which permanently defined their relationship. Sarah spoke over lunch with journalists James Whittaker and Nigel Nelson. Her remarks were extraordinarily candid for anyone dating the heir to the throne. She discussed anorexia, earlier drinking, and what she jokingly described as thousands of boyfriends. The number was clearly rhetorical, not a literal accounting of her private life. Yet once printed, the remarks created an image of chaos and indiscretion. Sarah also admitted preserving press cuttings about the romance, imagining that she might one day show them to her grandchildren. Then came the sentence Charles could not ignore. Sarah said she was not in love with him. She added that she would not marry a man she did not love, whether he was a dustman or the King of England. It was an astonishing rejection of the very hierarchy surrounding them. Charles was reportedly furious and told Sarah she had done something extremely foolish. Their courtship ended soon afterward. The conventional interpretation is simple. Sarah talked too much and destroyed her chance to become queen. But that explanation leaves out her clearest statement. She said she did not love him. Was the interview merely an impulsive act of self-sabotage? Or did Sarah use public candor to escape a relationship that private pressure might otherwise have prolonged? The evidence cannot reveal an unconscious motive. Yet her own words make one conclusion difficult to defend, that she desperately wanted the marriage and spent the rest of her life resenting Diana for taking it. Sarah certainly lost control of the publicity. She exposed matters the royal circle expected to remain private and discovered how quickly Charles could withdraw. But she also articulated a boundary that many people around the prince seemed reluctant to acknowledge. Rank did not create love. A crown did not correct incompatibility. This raises a sharper question. Did Sarah lose the greatest opportunity of her life, or avoid the marriage that later wounded her younger sister? Hindsight makes the second possibility almost irresistible. At the time, however, nobody knew what Charles and Diana's marriage would become. Sarah did not disappear from Charles's world. Through family gatherings and country weekends, he encountered Diana again. Sarah later described herself to reporters with two economical words: "I'm Cupid." The phrase tied her permanently to the royal marriage that followed. It is often repeated as uncomplicated pride, but its emotional meaning is impossible to recover. Perhaps Sarah was genuinely delighted for Diana. Perhaps humor helped her manage the awkwardness of seeing her former boyfriend court her younger sister. It may also have allowed her to claim a small degree of authorship over a story the press had taken from her. None of those possibilities can be proved. What can be established is that Sarah publicly supported the match. Claims that she spent those years consumed by jealousy rely far more on dramatic imagination than documented behavior. By then, Sarah had chosen a different future. In May 1980, she married Neil McCorquodale. He was not a consolation prize, nor does the evidence justify describing her marriage as exile from royal splendor. Together, they built a durable family life and later had 3 children: Emily, George, and Celia. Their home near Grantham, Lincolnshire, placed Sarah within country society rather than daily palace life. Over time, she became active in local responsibilities, eventually serving as High Sheriff of Lincolnshire and becoming associated with the Belvoir hunt. The life was quieter than Diana's, but quiet did not mean insignificant. This distinction matters because later storytelling often measures every Spencer woman against Diana's visibility. By that standard, privacy looks like defeat, and ordinary domestic continuity looks like retreat. Sarah's marriage suggests another reading. She did not obtain the royal position once imagined for her, but she created a life capable of surviving beyond newspaper cycles. That stability would later make her both a refuge for Diana and a reminder of the alternative Diana never received. 1 year after Sarah's wedding, Diana prepared to marry Charles before a worldwide audience. The speed of the courtship left the young bride with serious doubts. According to the account Diana later provided for Andrew Morton, she raised those fears with Sarah and Jane shortly before the ceremony. Diana told them she could not go through with it. Her sisters answered that her face was already on the tea towels, so it was too late to withdraw. The line sounds chilling when heard after the divorce, the interviews, and Paris. In the moment, it may have been an attempt to make light of panic before an event that seemed impossible to stop. Still, the question remains. Sarah had once found enough resolve to reject Charles publicly. Why did she not help Diana do the same privately? There is no easy answer. Diana was 20, the heir's chosen bride, and the wedding machinery was already moving at national scale. Sarah and Jane may have believed that nervousness was natural. They could not foresee the specific loneliness, infidelity, and public conflict that would follow. To say they should have rescued Diana is emotionally understandable. To say they knowingly delivered her into disaster is unsupported. The remark about tea towels matters because it reveals how thoroughly public expectation had overtaken private choice. Even inside the Spencer family, canceling the wedding no longer seemed like a realistic option. There was another painful imbalance. Sarah had dated Charles as an adult with more social experience, while Diana entered the royal courtship as a sheltered teenager. Sarah could judge the prince without already being presented as Britain's future princess. By the time Diana voiced her fears, withdrawal threatened not merely a relationship, but two families, palace planning, and a global spectacle. Her sisters may have mistaken institutional momentum for inevitability. As the marriage progressed, Sarah did not simply retreat into resentment. She remained a part of Diana's life, accompanied her on engagements, and was regarded as one of the people Diana could trust. At times, she performed duties resembling those of a lady-in-waiting, supporting her sister through a role that blended family intimacy with royal service. That arrangement carried its own tension. Sarah assisted the woman who occupied the public position once associated with Sarah's name. It would be unrealistic to assume no complicated feelings ever arose. Complication, however, is not the same as consuming jealousy. Affection, irritation, protectiveness, and old rivalry can exist together in any sisterhood, especially when one member becomes internationally famous and the others are constantly defined through her. Their shared experience of disordered eating may have created a painful form of recognition. Sarah knew that the illness was not a superficial complaint. When Diana later described bulimia and despair, Sarah may have understood parts of that suffering better than most people around the princess. Yet understanding did not guarantee harmony. Sisters can share wounds without interpreting them in the same way. Sarah had survived public embarrassment and built stability outside the palace. Diana increasingly believed survival required exposing what happened inside it. That difference would become decisive when Diana cooperated with Andrew Morton. For Sarah, the disclosures complicated a close but sometimes difficult sisterhood. For Jane, they struck directly at the institution her husband served. Jane was not approaching the crisis from the margins. She was already living beside the machinery Diana was preparing to challenge. Born Cynthia Jane Spencer. In 1957, Jane developed a markedly different public character from Sarah. At West Heath, she was remembered as a serious student who became a prefect and collected strong examination results. Where Sarah pushed against boundaries, Jane learned how to operate within them. That contrast should not be mistaken for emotional simplicity. Discipline can be an expression of confidence, but it can also offer shelter from unpredictability. After watching her parents' marriage dissolve, Jane may have found reassurance in rules that remained stable when relationships did not. In April 1978, she married Robert Fellows at the Guards Chapel in Wellington Barracks. Diana, still a teenager, served as a bridesmaid. The ceremony joined Jane not only to a husband, but to a man beginning a long career inside the royal household. Robert had entered royal service the previous year as an assistant private secretary. He was discreet, methodical, and suited to an institution that depended upon confidential advice. He later became deputy private secretary, then the Queen's principal private secretary in 1990. Jane and Robert had 3 children, Laura, Alexander, and Eleanor. Their family life offered continuity, respectability, and close proximity to the crown. Jane and Diana even lived near one another within the Kensington Palace estate, close enough for sisterly support to have seemed natural. Robert's work required a temperament almost opposite to Diana's emerging public style. Private secretaries advise, absorb pressure, and speak through carefully controlled channels. Diana increasingly relied upon personal testimony, emotional immediacy, and direct connection with the public. Jane lived between these communication systems. A conversation that felt like sisterly confidence to Diana might contain information Robert could not responsibly ignore, while professional caution could make Jane seem evasive. But physical closeness did not remove the conflict built into Jane's marriage. Robert's duty was to the sovereign and the institution. Diana's needs were personal, emotional, and increasingly hostile to the palace system. Jane could not respond to one side without the other side questioning her loyalty. Did Jane marry Robert partly because his ordered world promised the stability missing from her childhood? No surviving evidence can answer such a private question. Yet the marriage placed her inside precisely the kind of structure Sarah resisted and Diana eventually confronted. At first, that position might have made Jane a useful bridge. She understood Diana as a sister and knew palace life through Robert, but a bridge is also where opposing forces meet. As Charles and Diana's marriage deteriorated, Jane's access became less an advantage than a trap. The crisis burst into public view in 1992 with Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story. Diana had secretly contributed recorded testimony, although the extent of her involvement was not publicly acknowledged at first. The book described bulimia, despair, self-harm, and Charles's continuing attachment to Camilla Parker Bowles. The disclosures carried added weight for Sarah. She had experienced an eating disorder before Diana became famous, but her suffering remained largely private and poorly understood. Diana's account now placed similar pain at the center of a global argument about royal marriage. Sarah may have recognized her sister's symptoms, while disagreeing with the method of revelation. Shared experience could produce compassion without creating agreement about what should be public. For Diana, disclosure offered a way to recover authority over a life narrated by courtiers and newspapers. She could finally describe what royal photographs concealed. For the palace, the book represented a breach of trust, with consequences reaching beyond an unhappy marriage. Robert Fellows stood near the center of the response. As the Queen's private secretary, he advised the sovereign during one of the monarchy's most damaging periods. He could not treat the revelation solely as the suffering of his sister-in-law. He also had to consider the stability of the crown. Jane therefore faced two truths that could not be comfortably joined. Diana had endured genuine distress. Robert had genuine professional obligations. Publicly supporting one could appear to condemn the other. Jane's position also created a quieter asymmetry. Diana could appeal directly to strangers who felt they knew her, while Jane could not explain her constraints without discussing Robert's confidential work. The more Diana spoke, the more Jane's silence attracted suspicion. Yet any public defense might have reinforced the impression that palace officials were coordinating against the princess. Remaining silent protected official boundaries, but it surrendered Jane's side of the story to everyone else. Some accounts suggest Diana believed Robert belonged to the group she called the men in gray suits. In her mind, such officials represented an impersonal machine determined to contain her. Later suspicions went further, implying that information about Diana traveled through Robert to the Queen. The public record does not establish that Robert secretly monitored Diana. His position inevitably required information and advice, but that is not proof of a personal campaign against her. Still, perception can damage trust almost as effectively as evidence. Did Diana distrust Jane because her sister had actually betrayed a confidence? Or had Robert's office made Jane a symbol of everything Diana feared? Once those possibilities merged in Diana's mind, ordinary sisterly silence could look like institutional hostility. Jane's response was characteristically restrained. She did not publicly attack Diana, but neither did she become her visible defender. To observers sympathetic to the princess, that neutrality appeared cold. To those inside the palace, it may have been the only position compatible with Robert's office. Silence, however, is never empty within a wounded family. Diana had spent much of her life seeking unmistakable signs that relatives would choose her. Jane's refusal to take a public side may therefore have hurt more than open disagreement. It repeated the emotional pattern established during childhood. When family and structure collided, structure appeared to win. But was Jane protecting Robert, protecting her children, or preventing an even harsher confrontation between Diana and the palace? She may have been attempting all three. The difficulty is that restraint which feels responsible to one person may feel like abandonment to another. The conflict intensified in 1995 when Diana recorded her panorama interview with Martin Bashir. Before millions of viewers, she discussed bulimia, adultery, isolation, and the famous third person in her marriage. The interview pushed a private war into constitutional territory. Its power came from Diana's controlled delivery. She did not appear as a distant figure speaking through an authorized statement. She addressed viewers as a woman describing a marriage from inside its wreckage. For Jane, the broadcast collapsed the boundary between sister and institution. Millions heard Diana's pain, while Robert's office calculated what her words meant for the Queen, the succession, and the monarchy's credibility. Later investigation established that Bashir used deception to obtain Diana's trust. False documents and misleading claims encouraged her belief that people around her were conspiring against her. This later truth does not erase Diana's suffering. It shows how her existing fears were deliberately aggravated by someone promising to help her speak. That revelation also complicates any judgment of Jane. Diana's suspicions cannot simply be dismissed as fantasy because palace conflict was real. Yet some suspicions were intensified through manipulation. Jane may have been condemned in a story whose most damaging assumptions were never fairly tested. Could Robert have cared deeply for Diana while believing her methods endangered the monarchy? Those positions are not mutually exclusive. Years later, he described her with affection and sadness, suggesting that professional conflict had not eliminated personal concern. Sources also disagree about how completely Jane and Diana became estranged. Paul Burrell later claimed the sisters had not spoken for years. Other people familiar with the family described serious tension without a total break. They remained neighbors, relatives, and members of a family whose connections rarely fit clean categories. The honest conclusion is narrower than the dramatic one. Their relationship was strained, and Robert's office contributed to that strain. We cannot prove Jane severed all contact, spied on Diana, or knowingly assisted a campaign against her. By the time Charles and Diana divorced in 1996, the original royal romance had collapsed before the world. Sarah remained an intermittent source of family support. Jane remained private. Neither sister found a way to resolve the deeper question of what Diana expected from them. Then the opportunity disappeared. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Diana died after the car carrying her crashed in Paris. News moved rapidly between governments, palaces, and family members. Her father could not be informed. John Spencer had died 5 years earlier, in 1992. Sarah and Jane joined Prince Charles on the journey to France. Whatever disagreements had shaped the previous years, they now entered the hospital as Diana's sisters. Titles, briefings, and old resentments could not alter what waited inside. The emotional force of that moment does not require invented dialogue. Sarah had once dated the man walking beside her. Jane was married to the official helping the Queen navigate the aftermath. Between them lay the body of the sister, whose marriage had transformed all their lives. They accompanied Diana's coffin back to Britain. The image carried a painful reversal. Years earlier, the Spencer family had watched Diana depart for the palace as a future queen. Now her sisters brought her back after the palace, the marriage, and the public struggle had all failed to give her peace. Public mourning then grew at a speed neither palace nor family could control. Flowers gathered outside royal residences, while anger rose over the monarchy's restrained response. Sarah and Jane were grieving privately as the nation demanded visible emotion from everyone connected to Diana. Once again, family sorrow became a public test. Even mourning had to be interpreted through competing expectations of blood, duty, and royal presentation. At Westminster Abbey, Sarah read Turn Again to Life by Mary Lee Hall. Jane read Time is by Henry Van Dyke. Their brother, Charles Spencer, delivered the eulogy that openly criticized the forces surrounding Diana. The two men named Charles must remain distinct. Prince Charles was Diana's former husband and the father of William and Harry. Charles Spencer was Diana's younger brother, Earl Spencer, after their father's death. Confusing them distorts both the family and the funeral. Sarah's and Jane's readings did not explain their private relationships with Diana. They offered no defense and no confession. Yet could those poems have carried words the sisters had failed to say while she was alive? That question cannot be answered from trembling voices or funeral photographs. Grief is not proof of guilt, and privacy is not proof of innocence. What the ceremony revealed was simpler. Whatever distance had existed, both women had lost a sister with whom reconciliation was no longer possible. After the funeral, Sarah accepted a public responsibility for Diana's legacy. She became a co-executor of her sister's will and president of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. The organization distributed millions of pounds to charitable causes before completing its work. The role required more than ceremonial association. The fund had to translate spontaneous grief into sustained programs, evaluate applications, defend Diana's name, and decide how long the organization should operate. Those decisions inevitably disappointed some supporters. They also show that Sarah's relationship with Diana's memory was not limited to anniversary appearances. For years, she dealt with practical consequences of a worldwide emotional response to her sister's death. Managing that legacy brought difficult decisions. Diana's image had immense emotional and commercial value. Every proposed product, interview, and commemorative project raised questions about dignity, ownership, and the boundary between remembrance and exploitation. Some critics interpreted Sarah's protectiveness as control. That conclusion overlooks the responsibility attached to administering a global icon's name. Saying no could appear possessive, while saying yes risked allowing Diana's memory to become a marketplace. Was Sarah's work an act of duty, love, or private repair? The motives may have overlapped. She had introduced Diana to Charles and later watched the marriage destroy itself publicly. Preserving the charitable side of Diana's legacy offered meaningful work where the past itself could not be changed. Sarah also maintained the life she had built with Neil and their children. Her long marriage challenges the suggestion that she remained frozen in jealousy over Charles. She continued supporting William and Harry, linking Diana's sons to the maternal family that existed before royal life. Jane chose a less visible form of continuity. She gave no memoir explaining whether Diana had misunderstood her. She did not build a public identity around inside knowledge of the palace. Her silence protected privacy, but it also allowed other people to write motives into the empty space. She nevertheless remained connected to Diana's sons. Jane attended William's wedding to Catherine in 2011. At Harry's wedding to Meghan in 2018, she delivered a reading. Her daughter Laura became a godmother to Princess Charlotte, preserving another quiet link between the Fellows, Spencer, and Windsor families. Robert received a life peerage in 1999, 2 years after Diana's death, and became Baron Fellows. He left royal service and pursued other public responsibilities. He died in 2024, with both William and Harry attending his funeral. By 2026, Jane was a widow who had spent decades resisting demands to explain herself. Her continued presence around Diana's sons does not prove every wound healed. It does suggest that family connection survived the accusations, silences, and competing loyalties of the 1990s. Sarah and Jane therefore preserved Diana in opposite ways. Sarah worked through public charity and formal stewardship. Jane relied upon discretion, family occasions, and relationships kept outside the press. Were these two expressions of love or two methods of living with regret. Perhaps they were both. Sarah acted where action was possible. Jane withheld words that could no longer be answered by the person most affected. It is tempting to turn their lives into a clean moral contrast. Sarah spoke and paid for speaking. Jane remained silent and paid for silence. Diana rejected both strategies, using the global media to make private pain impossible to ignore. Yet none of those choices brought uncomplicated freedom. Sarah's candor ended one royal courtship and permanently tied her to another. Jane's restraint protected her household while weakening trust with her sister. Diana's public disclosures gave her a voice, but also exposed her to manipulation, hostility, and relentless attention. Perhaps Sarah and Jane did not deliberately abandon Diana. Perhaps they simply underestimated how alone she felt until there was no time left to respond. The tragedy may not rest upon one betrayal, but upon several people believing someone else would provide the help Diana needed. That does not make every decision equal. The tea towel remark remains painful. Jane's silence remains open to interpretation. Sarah's introduction of Diana to Charles remains one of history's most consequential family connections. But hindsight grants certainty that the sisters never possessed. Sarah could not see Paris when she called herself Cupid. Jane could not know that professional neutrality would later be examined as evidence of personal disloyalty. Both made choices within moments whose endings were still hidden. So how should Jane's silence be understood? Betrayal, self-protection, or the only workable choice available to her? And did Sarah's honesty save her from the life that later consumed Diana? Share your view in the comments and tell us which sister you understand more. If you value thoughtful royal histories beyond the palace facade like this video, and subscribe to the Palace Circle. Thank you for watching. Diana became the sister the world heard. Sarah and Jane lived with everything left unsaid.